Our text is going to be Genesis chapter 2. We looked at this text last week, and we're going to come back to it this week, verses 18 through 25, although the things we're going to be talking about is really a study of the first 3 chapters of Genesis, so we're going to be jumping around quite a bit. But the purpose of the lesson this week is to provide a biblical and theological foundation for some of the things that we talked about last week. If you were here in the sermon last week, we were discussing the sin of envy, and in particular, the resentment which drives that particular sin. And I gave a contemporary example of that kind of resentment, what we might call the resentment of feminism. And in that discussion, I talked about some of the differences between men and women, both intrinsic differences, which is to say differences in physical differences between us, but also in terms of roles that we are to play. Roles that we're to play in the family, in marriage, roles that we are to play in the church, and even to some extent out into the rest of society. And so what I hope to do this morning is to begin a conversation in which we lay the biblical foundation, a sure foundation for those differences. And maybe another way to say it is, I want to engage in kind of a prolonged meditation upon the opening chapters of Genesis so that we might catch a glimpse of this vision that God has for us with regards to manhood and womanhood. Who are we as men? Who are we as women? And what are the relationships that we're supposed to have with one another? And I think that's possible. The reason to focus on the opening chapters of Genesis is because I think in the first couple of chapters, what we have is a paradigmatic text, which is to say that I'm convinced that what God is laying out for us here is a hierarchy of the divine order that we are to bring our lives into harmony with. And I think there's good precedent for reading these chapters that way, because it seems to be this is the way Jesus read these chapters, and also the Apostle Paul. And so in saying that, in casting this biblical vision of manhood and womanhood, what we're going to be doing in part is pushing back against what some people have called, and maybe it's not a fair name, but what some people have called evangelical feminism. Now, the word feminism is a slippery term. Since the sort of ascendancy of secular feminism in the mid-20th century, the ideology has become quite broad. There's many strands of feministic thought, and it's a broad church, we might say, as an ideology. There's first and second and third wave feminism. And so we're not going to talk about all of the nuances that are there. We're going to speak of it rather generally. But that particular movement has had a significant impact upon the evangelical church. Most notably,